As we've been saying in the last couple of videos, A Hard Day's Night was a very important album and movie and just moment, a career moment for the Beatles. So what do you do to follow on A Hard Day's Night? When Beatles for Sale came out in 1964, a lot of people thought that the album was really not as good as A Hard Day's Night. And that got a lot of tongues wagging, saying things like, was this it for the Beatles? They've sort of crested, it's over. This actually, surprisingly enough, happens again and again after Magical Mystery Tour. Oh, the Beatles have finally flopped. Now they'll never come back. And of course, they came back plenty good from that. So this is one of those moments where we're not really quite sure if we're following in real time what's happening with the Beatles, but something different is happening than what was going on with A Hard Day's Night. Now, in the time leading up to the release of Beatles for Sale in December of 1964, there were a couple of singles released, and right after it, I Feel Fine, a John song, backed with She's a Woman. Both of those were released in November of 1964, so just a month before the album came out, going to number one in both countries. That is, I Feel Fine going to number one in both countries, and She's a Woman, the flip side of the record, going to number four in this country. Again, getting on our topic about the relationship between craft and art, between using standardized patterns versus innovation and new kinds of things. Both of these singles follow the often used AABA form. There are some changes there, but still they're AABA form tunes. It's like when John and Paul decide they're going to write a single, they stick to the recipe with some innovation, but they play it pretty safe in terms of something that they think the public is going to be readily appreciate. Maybe some of the experimentation is saved for the album tracks, at least initially. It's important to note that I Feel Fine has an introduction employing a guitar hook. That is, that first lick on the tune becomes sort of a guitar lick that comes back. And we're going to follow a whole series of songs, sort of song strings, that use this guitar intro thing. It starts with I Feel Fine. We'll hear a little bit more of that in 8 Days a Week. Then we've got Day Tripper and Ticket to Ride, all of which sort of start with this guitar lick kind of thing. Not unlike the way something like the Rolling Stones' I Can't Get No Satisfaction sort of starts with a guitar lick. For a band that's primarily a vocal band, primarily a song band, having a tune that starts with a guitar lick is maybe a little bit less likely. But of course, they were all fans of Chuck Berry, and how many of those Chuck Berry songs start with that sort of very distinguished Chuck Berry style of guitar lick with the double stops on the electric guitar. So anyway, I Feel Fine being one of the first ones that we see starting with a kind of a distinctive guitar lick there. Also, the very beginning of I Feel Fine has got a little bit of a use of feedback. It happened quite by accident. I think the way it worked is that John had his acoustic electric guitar laying up against the amp and the sound, the volume was not completely turned down, and Paul hit a note on his bass. The guitar began to resonate sympathetically, and as it did, the guitar began to feed back against the amp, and it made that sound that you hear at the very beginning. And the Beatles thought it was such a cool song, they wanted to keep it. And so somewhere in the Beatles anthology, George Harrison jokes, so you see, John Lennon invented Jimi Hendrix. Of course, that's not exactly the way it was. But this was the way the Beatles were. They would hear a sound that sounded, well, that's cool, could we try to use that? And they would put it into the music. One of the great achievements we'll talk about as we go along is how when they had popularity, they cashed their commercial success in for artistic license. They didn't cash their commercial success in for prolonging their commercial success. They did that, but they also invested it in artistic license since they were able to expand the music and expand what they were able to do because they had enough success to be allowed for the people who held the money to allow them to do it. And so this is a small indication of that in I Feel Fine. Just after the release of Beatles for Sale, 8 Days a Week from that album was released as a single in the U.S. and did quite well. The album itself was recorded August through October 1964, so in the officially, in all ways, sort of post A Hard Day's Night phase. It was released in December of 1964. Of course, going to number one in the UK and in the US. Beatles 65 in this country is kinda that record, but not exactly. On the original album cover, a lot of commentators have said the Beatles look tired. Are they fame-weary? is this pace they've been on from 1963 to 1964 really beginning to take its toll. What about the title of the album, Beatles for Sale? I mean, is this ironic, cynical, playful? What does it exactly mean when you say Beatles for sale? Is it sort of poking at the commercial machine, saying you need more product for us, so here's some more Beatles for sale? Are the Beatles beginning to push back on this commercial mechanism that's sort of responsible for all of their fame and fortune and all this? Are they beginning to push back against that mechanism a little bit? After all, A Hard Day's Night is a kind of a goofy title for something. And think of some of the titles that follow from this: Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver. Actually, what is a record that's something that revolves? Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So there is a sense in which the Beatles are pushing back a little bit. Maybe we see it in terms of their humor, but Beatles for Sale, the way that cover looks, I don't know. In many ways, I think they're beginning to sort of they can see the machinery that's building this whole thing, and they're a little bit dubious of all of it. They're enjoying the fruits of the fame, but they're always aware that there's a machine that's making it happen. And I think these are the moments in which you can beginning to see that pushback start to happen. Of course, later there'll be much more pushback as the Beatles get more politically involved. Once again, we have 6 cover songs on this album. We had no cover songs on A Hard Day's Night. The EP, Long Tall Sally, yeah, there were 3 there. But here we have 6 cover songs and 8 originals. This time 4 by Paul, only 3 by John. Remember before, John had the lion's share, 10 songs on A Hard Day's Night. We only get 3 from him. This time 4 by Paul and 1 composed together by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Of those 8 originals, 5 of them are AABA songs. So again, we see a lot of sort of prevalence of that form still in Beatles for Sale. When you add that to the singles we talked about just a minute ago, most of the music then on this project from this fall comes out as AABA song. Now, if there's so few originals, at least compared to A Hard Day's Night, why is that? Is there too little time to write new songs? I mean, look, we're talking about the Beatles producing 2 albums a year plus singles while they're busy making movies and running around doing every possible concert they can possibly do. That is an awful lot to try to do and try to squeeze songwriting and recording and everything into all that. So maybe there's too little time to write songs. But I think in many ways what you see happening in Beatles for Sale is the Beatles recalibrating their style, having achieved what they set out to achieve as pop artists with A Hard Day's Night. They're sort of thinking about how they can, maybe reinvent is too strong a word, but that's the idea of what I'm going for, trying to reinvent what the Beatles are. I hear an awful lot of country influence in Beatles for Sale, more than in some of the other records. And the return to the cover versions, to me, might mean that they didn't have enough material, but it might also mean that they're sort of searching back to their roots again to get a kind of fresh start. Remember that the first wave of Beatles music really started out of cover versions and then emerged into what it was with A Hard Day's Night. Now they go back to the cover versions, start thinking about who they are, what they do, start getting maybe a little bit ambitious in certain kinds of ways. This might have been influenced by a meeting the Beatles had with Bob Dylan in the fall, late August, early fall of 1964. And at that meeting, which is reputed to be the one, I'll tell the story next week about the first time the Beatles were introduced to marijuana. And not like they'd been innocent of drugs, they'd done plenty of amphetamines when they were in Hamburg, but they were introduced to marijuana for the first time, again, reportedly through this meeting with Dylan. But Dylan challenged John Lennon and Paul McCartney to maybe do something a little bit more than just kind of teen love songs. So in many ways, Dylan challenged them to be, he wouldn't have said it in these ways, but to be more artists than brill-building style pop writers. And so I think that suggestion, we're really starting to see the beginnings that some of this music had started to be recorded before the Dylan interviews, the Dylan meeting. And so this may only apply to some of the music that was recorded for this record, but still you can see that change happening. And so if Beatles for Sale is a different record from the ones that came before it, especially from A Hard Day's Night. It's maybe because by saying Beatles for sale, they're questioning the whole commercial element of what it is Beatles music is about. And the music starts to reflect that. Now, of the covers, we can talk through those very quickly. We've got Rock and Roll Music, which had been a hit for Chuck Berry in 1957. Mr. Moonlight, a 1962 song originally done by Dr. Feelgood and the Interns. Kansas City, a Lieber and Stoller song, together with Hey, 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 had been done by Little Richard. Words of Love, a great double-tracked song by Buddy Holly from 1957. Honey Don't, a Carl Perkins song from 1956. And Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, another Carl Perkins song from 1958. The Beatles really liked Carl Perkins. George Harrison, during a period when they were still very young, and they decided they were going to change their names. John Lennon became Long John Lennon. Paul McCartney became Paul Ramon, and George Harrison was so taken up by Carl Perkins that he changed his name to Carl Harrison, which he always thought was, always laughed about later as not being much of a change, but it was significant to him. So Carl Perkins, here we have a couple of Carl Perkins covers on this album. The John songs, No Reply, I'm a Loser, and I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. We'll come back to I'm a Loser in just a minute, but my general remark about the John songs on this record are, if somebody tells you to start getting more serious about your lyrics, most young songwriters, the first place they'll go is to a kind of, not exactly a pity party, but they want to start talking about the unhappy things, the way they've been disappointed, their inner failings, and all of these kinds of things. So when we see John Lennon writing lyrics like he does in No Reply, which are about a girl not, answering his phone calls, like that really happened, what happened to John Lennon at this time. I'm a loser. Gosh, I'm a loser with a hit album. I don't want to spoil the party, so I'll go. You see, these are all kind of dark and sort of trying to sort of show emotion that is his first stab at trying to do something maybe a little bit more than the simple kind of teen love song. So I think this is the road to some of the stuff that we're going to see in Help and Rubber Soul and Revolver, and it starts there. And Paul McCartney songs are interesting in a different kind of way. I'll Follow the Sun, 8 Days a Week, Every Little Thing, and What You're Doing. Paul remains mostly sunny and upbeat, which seems to be his sort of default setting anyway. But you start to hear some kind of symphonic hints in this music. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about what I think of as the symphonic hint or the symphonic element of 8 Days a Week, which resides mostly in the introduction, fade in, and the introduction and the way that comes back at the end and how it sort of fades in and sounds almost sort of symphonic as an introduction. It's also kind of a guitar introduction, so we can connect it up with I Feel Fine. But in Every Little Thing, we've got Ringo either playing timpani or tom-toms that are tuned to sound like timpani during the Every Little Thing chorus. And it really sounds a little bit more symphonic. It isn't much of a stretch to Paul on the next album, turning to strings and Yesterday and some of the other kinds of things that would happen with classical music, blending classical music into Beatles stuff. So when you hear things like what's going on in 8 Days a Week and Every Little Thing, they're little bits, but you can see that later there'll be more. Those bits will get larger and larger and play a larger and larger role. One last song that I think might be kind of fun to talk about is the song Babies in Black, a song written together by John and Paul. You're going to read stories about what this song is about. I would suggest at least one interpretation. You should listen to the song and find the lyrics on the internet and see what you think. But I think in many ways this song, Babies in Black, could be written about Astrid and Stu during the Hamburg days. Babies in Black because she's mourning the loss. But the guy who's doing the singing actually wishes she was in love with him, but she can't be in love with him because she's still mourning the loss of the other, and this kind of thing. And you begin to wonder what might have been going on with Astrid, Stu, John, Paul, or whatever. I don't mean to cast any aspersions on anything, but these were just young people, relationships. And so I wonder whether Babies in Black is actually more autobiographical than a lot of people have mentioned, at least up to this point. Well, let's turn to a couple of song close-ups now from the second half of 1964 and take a closer look at I'm a Loser and 8 Days a Week.